Hi, I'm Hobie1. This is Red Chair Reading. Today we're reading the Black Book of Secrets by F.E. Higgins. Chapter 21, Let's Go. Stirling Oliphant. As the days wore on, more and more villagers were benefiting not only from Joe's generous payments for their pond goods, but also from his midnight trade. Although they didn't talk about their good fortune, it was obvious that something was afoot. Without a doubt, Joe was the breath of fresh air the village had needed for a long, long time. The place seemed brighter somehow, as if the buildings themselves had released a huge sigh and relaxed back to allow the light in. One morning, the whole street was brought to a standstill when the clouds parted for a minute or two, and blue sky was seen in between. "It's a miracle," declared Ruby Sourdough. Of course, the clouds came over again, and the blue sky was gone. But it was enough to know that it did exist. Whether this was a miracle or not, the one person in the village who was actually qualified to make such a statement was still in bed and missed the historic event. The Reverend Stirling Oliphant. For 20 years, Stirling Oliphant had looked at himself in the mirror every morning, usually not far off noon, and congratulated himself on his posting to Pagus Parvis. A man of his ilk couldn't have asked for a better job. His ilk being that of a lazy, slovenly boor whose purported belief in higher powers furnished him with an easy living. When he had arrived in the village 2 decades ago, he had stood at the gates to the church and cast a bushy-browed, fat-rimmed eye down the hill. "This is what I have been waiting for," he thought. "That hill must be 40 degrees, if not more." In those days, the villagers were a little more inclined to listen to the word of the Lord. So much so, Stirling's disappointment for nearly 8 months was forced to preach a sermon every Sunday. His distinct monotone and the repetitive nature of his subject, the devil, the dark side, hellfire, brimstone, and all related issues, ensured that he addressed an ever-dwindling audience. Eventually, as was his desire, it dwindled to none. Henceforth, Stirling passed his days restfully, enjoying fine wines and good food at the church's expense, and generally doing as he wished, which was very little. He still thought of God. There had to be one, for how else could a man be blessed with such good fortune? Now Stirling was more than a little disconcerted by the events of the past weeks. For his exalted position at the top of the hill, he had not failed to notice the increase in pedestrian traffic. At first he thought the villagers might be coming to him, expecting a service of some kind, and he breathed a sigh of relief when he realized that Joe Zabadow was the draw. Stirling had grown used to a life of ease, with little interruption, and certainly no demands from his flock. When Jeremiah had approached him with the body-snatching business plan, Stirling saw no reason to stand in his way, and he was handsomely rewarded with gifts from Jeremiah's wine cellar. Excellent. This might not strike you as characteristic of Jeremiah until you consider that he drank most of his donations when he came to see Stirling on Thursdays. Stirling had seen Joe Zabadow and his young assistant that first morning in the graveyard, but he was not inclined to welcome formally the new members of his congregation. Later, Polly, who came up every day to cook and clean, by arrangement with Jeremiah, told him that the hat shop had a new owner. "A hatter?" asked the Reverend. "No, a pawnbroker." "A pawnbroker?" Polly didn't reply. Stirling had a tendency to turn statement to question. It helped enormously when you didn't have any answers. He had developed the habit in a previous parish, where the locals were an inquisitive bunch who enjoyed lively theological debate and were determined that Stirling should enjoy it too. "A pawnbroker?" he repeated. He considered briefly how this might affect his position in the village, and concluded that it wouldn't affect him at all. In fact, he didn't think Joe's arrival would have much effect on anyone. He was surprised, therefore, at the level of animosity Jeremiah Ratchet felt toward the newcomer. It was late afternoon, and the Reverend was dozing in a chair when he was brought rapidly back to wakefulness by a tremendous thumping on his door. Polly was there to open it, but she was elbowed out of the way as Jeremiah strode past her into the drawing room. "Jeremiah," said Stirling, "a pleasure. I'm sure it is Thursday already." "It's Tuesday, but I have an important matter to discuss with you." "Is it about Obadiah and the bodies?" "Not Obadiah, that blasted pawnbroker." Stirling roused himself to an upright position. "Mr. Sabe, whatever his name is, isn't he a harmless chap?" "Harmless?" spluttered Jeremiah. "Harmless? The man is the devil incarnate." Exhausted by his outburst and the trip up the hill, Jeremiah fell into the chair opposite the reverend. Polly handed him a drink, topped off Stirling's, and then made herself scarce. It did not do to stay in the same rooms as the pair. She much preferred to listen from outside the door. Jeremiah finished his glass in one gulp. Ooh. He reached over to the table and took the decanter and set it on the hearth beside him. "Stirling," he announced, "that pawnbroker is very bad for business. In particular, my business. He has filled his window with the greatest collection of junk you have ever seen, and not only that, he has paid for it." Stirling was trying to sound interested, but he had the beginnings of a headache and was overcome by the urge to yawn. "His payments are so wildly out of keeping with the true value of the pledges that I fear soon all the villagers will be able to pay off all their debts." "I see," said Stirling. If this is interesting to you, please boop the like button. You'll be helping the video spread to other people. You'll also be helping me, and thank you very much. "And if people aren't in debt to me, then how do I make money?" continued Jeremiah. And to emphasize his point fully, he leaned over and gave Stirling a poke with his fat forefinger. "You have to do something. My livelihood depends on it." Now Stirling was awake. "Me? Do something? What can I do?" "You must convince those peasants that Joe Zabadow is the devil's spawn." "Devil's pawn? But is it true?" Stirling had never before thought he might have to deal with the devil's pawn. "Pawn? Spawn?" said Jeremiah with intense irritation. "What's the truth got to do with it? This is business. They are to have no further doings with him upon pain of death." I'm not sure," Stirling said cautiously. "Just do it," snapped Jeremiah. And that Jeremiah is a character, huh? Well, that's the end of chapter 21. Thank you for joining me, and I'll catch you again in chapter 22.